Welcome to this session. Today we're going to talk about how to build great AWS apps that deliver amazing customer experience and do all of this in a very automated way. My name is Kalyan Ramanathan. I am the VP of Product Marketing at Sumo Logic. I'm not Bruno Kurtic, the guy on the right out there. He is our VP of Products. I've heard that I'm much handsomer than him, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Unfortunately, Bruno couldn't make it today. I'm joined by Bradley Segoviano. Bradley represents Genesys, one of our big customers and one of the very big contact centers on AWS. Bradley, you want to say a few words about yourself?
I'll get on mute, sorry. Yeah, so like you said, I'm Bradley Segoviano. I'm a lead software engineer with Genesys, and yeah, I'm excited to be up here and talk to everyone today.
Yeah, so we decided rather than Sumo Logic talk about what we do, we'd rather have a customer talk about what we do, because that's a much better sell for what we do, the products that we bring to the market, and the value that we provide customers like Genesys. So let's get started here. I'm going to skip this first slide, and I'm going to talk about Sumo Logic. For those of you who don't know who Sumo Logic is, right? We are a cloud-native machine data analytics platform, and we help our customers manage the operations and security of their mission-critical applications. So what does this all mean? We are cloud-native. We run in AWS. We have run in AWS for the last 9 years. In fact, our founder saw Werner Vogel when he was presenting in Stanford. This was when AWS was a little kernel of an idea. And he was talking about this new thing called a cloud that AWS is going to be building. And he said, you know what? That's what we need to be building our service on. That's what we need to be building our software on. And that's how we got started 9 years ago. It's a tiny little machine data analytics platform. So what we do is to collect logs, metrics, events from your applications, your services, your infrastructures. We bring it all into Sumo Logic. We analyze it 10 ways to Sunday, and then we provide you insights so that you can improve the performance as well as the security of your application. 9-year-old company, 2,000 customers, some great brand names. So Airbnb is a customer, Twitter is a customer, Anheuser-Busch, Pokemon, Epic Games, the guys behind Fortnite. Who else? Samsung SmartThings, of course, Genesys, CBS Interactive. When they were hosting the 2019 Super Bowl, they needed a service to manage the online experience of their service. Guess who they turned to? Sumo Logic, because we have AWS behind us. They can throw any amount of data, and we scale amazingly well. So we're a big data platform built on AWS. As you can see, collect petabytes of data, run terabytes and millions of analytics and searches on this data. And what really differentiates us are really a few things, right? First and foremost, we are cloud native. That helps a lot. Secondly, we are a platform that supports lots of use cases. So if you're looking to improve the performance of your application, if you're looking to improve the security posture of your application, if you want product analytics, if you want dev test analytics, if you want customer support use cases, we do all of that on one platform. And Bradley, I know when he goes through his session, he will talk about how Genesys uses us across the board for all these use cases. The fact that we are cloud native and the fact that we work with AWS provides us incredible scale and elasticity. I mentioned the CBS Super Bowl example. They sent us 70 terabytes of data over 4 hours. Just imagine this, 70 terabytes of data over 4 hours. We had to stand up an entire cloud just for that experience, pulled it all down after the experience was done. And that's the kind of scalability and elasticity that Sumo Logic can offer, built obviously on the back of an amazing cloud vendor like AWS. The solution is very flexible. The solution provides cloud economics, and what that means is that we essentially, the economics of your usage with Sumo Logic is built on the insights that you get from Sumo Logic. So the more the insights that you get, the more you pay for. The less the insights, you pay for it proportionally. Our solution provides very fast time to value. It's on the cloud. Sign up for our service, send us your data, and you should be up and running in a matter of a few minutes to hours. This is not days or weeks or months to set up a server and do all these other things. We cut through all that crap. We allow you to get value very quickly with the service. And then lastly, we realized that because we collect very mission-critical data about your service, we have to be secure. We have to make sure that your data is very secure with us. So we are PCI compliant, HIPAA compliant, SOC compliant, GDPR ready, FedRAMP ready. So, when your data comes to us, rest assured, it is very secure within the Sumo Logic service itself. So, just a quick, basics in terms of, what are the problems that we solve, right? Look, we all know that every company is going through digital transformation here, right? And as you go through digital transformation, you are building modern applications. And these modern applications of today are very different from the applications of yesterday, right? Everything changes in these modern applications. You don't use physical data centers. Who the heck buys a server anymore, right? We build everything in a cloud environment. You mostly don't deploy physical servers anymore. You do everything in containers like Docker because you get the time to value, you get the ephemerality and everything else that comes along with it. You don't build monolithic applications. You build microservices-based applications. We are a 9-year-old company, and even we started out building microservices 6 years ago. So I assume all of you guys out here are building microservices type applications. Your application and its security posture changes dramatically. I mean, what is an application anymore? It's not something that runs on a few servers. It's something that is in the cloud. That's something that works on your mobile devices. The concept of application itself has become very, very amorphous right now. So there is no such thing as a perimeter security within the application world. And then lastly, what we start to see more and more of is that the teams that manage these applications, they're not silos, right? There is no dev team, there is no test team, there is no ops team and a security team. Or if there are teams, these teams actually work very well together. Actually, Bradley would talk about how these guys are actually organized at Genesys, and it's a perfect example of how all these teams are coming together. We also see this new notion of DevSecOps that is forming in many organizations where dev, security, and ops, everything is combined. So we're starting to see lots of new changes as people go to modern apps. So all these things are changing, but for the folks in this audience out here, the DevOps teams or the DevOps people and the SRE people and the security folks, et cetera, your job hasn't in some sense changed, right? Your goals haven't changed. At the end of the day, if you are managing an application, you still have to deliver that application with amazing performance, right? Because every minute of that downtime of that application, has a real impact to your business. If you are a security person and if you are responsible for the security posture, the compliance of that application, you need to ensure that you look after every thread that comes into that application. Because guess what? A single security outage in that application, affects your brand, affects the revenue of your application itself. And then lastly, if you're let's say a dev persona or a release persona or somebody in the test world, you still have to release your applications at a much faster clip. Because if you don't, your competition is going to do that. So we see a dichotomy here. The applications are changing very quickly, but your goals are still the same. And there is an intelligence gap here. There is an insight gap here that you need to address if you really have to deliver on the goals of the business well. And that's really where Sumo Logic comes in, right? As I mentioned before, we are a machine data analytics platform. And so what we do is to collect telemetry from every component of your application. May it be an infrastructure, may it be a service, may it be a mobile device, may it be a router, a switch, a load balancer, a firewall, you name it. We bring all of that system, all of that data into Sumo Logic. We then start to analyze this data. You can do this using interactive searches, interactive queries. We also have machine learning built into our system, which allows you to automatically surface insights, automatically surface anomalies in your application so that you can be alerted when something is not right. And then once you have that information, we provide you a lot of troubleshooting capabilities within the system that will allow you to dig deeper into your data, get to the root cause of the problem, and then try and fix all of these issues. So there are multiple use cases that are supported by Sumo Logic. Operational analytics, operational intelligence, as you see out here, that's more around performance and availability management, making sure that the SLAs that you have committed to your business are indeed being maintained. Security intelligence is around it's around security and compliance management. Business intelligence is around product analytics. It's around user usage analytics. A lot of our customers, they are running their business on their software applications. So imagine that. All the data from these software applications allows you to now understand the revenues that are driving your businesses. And then the last capability solution that we have is what we call global intelligence. Now, this is a new service that we released about a year ago. And the whole notion out here is, look, we are in the cloud. Since we are in the cloud, and since we manage over 2,000 customers, we see a lot of what is going on in the cloud. So imagine if you can take benchmarks across these customers and apply it to other customers. That's what global intelligence means, providing you that global insight in terms of how are all these customers consuming AWS services in the cloud. So without further ado now, let me turn it over to Brad to talk about how Genesys and Bradley and his team consume and use Sumo Logic at Genesys.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Kalyan. So as Kalyan said earlier, hi everyone, my name is Bradley Segoviano. I'm a lead software engineer with Genesys. I work on our DevOps/AWS infrastructure team. I want to thank everyone again for coming out. I know it's late and everybody's been to lots and lots of sessions and stuff, so everyone's probably hungry. So what is Pure Cloud? So Pure Cloud is a large-scale contact center built entirely on AWS. And what we're going to talk about today, which Kalyan kind of addressed, is that we're going to talk about how we are taking our logs and our data, sending it to Sumo, and we're using automation to help us enable a NOC-less environment, how we're able to do all these different things with our data. Hopefully I'll give you a couple examples that are unique. Hopefully I'll give you guys a couple examples that you guys can take back to your environment and possibly apply them. So a little bit about our AWS scale. So we have about 370 microservices. Last year I did a talk here at AWS, and that number was 320. So over the last year, almost to the day, a year ago, over the last year, the application development teams decided they were going to add in another almost 50 different microservices. We have 10 AWS accounts. We're fully deployed. A full Pure Cloud deployment is done to each of those regions. So in each of those regions, we're deploying all 370 of those microservices. We're completely DevOps, so all the software development teams that build the code, they're responsible for operating it, defining their infrastructure, maintaining it. They're the ones who get alerted. We'll go into that a little bit more in a second. Completely immutable. We're completely NOC-free, so we have no NOC team. And we're PCI and HIPAA. On the side of the actual scale of our infrastructure in AWS, at the time I grabbed this data, it obviously fluctuates large over a huge span, but we go from anywhere from a few thousand instances up to 15, 20,000 instances, depending on load, depending on performance testing, production load, all that type of stuff. So at the time I took this, we had about 11,000 EC2 instances. Everything we deploy is in an auto-scaling group, so we do not deploy a single EC2 instance outside of an auto-scaling group. It's required, you have to deploy in there. All the auto-scaling groups have at least 2 instances, and obviously they scale up to hundreds and down as small to 2. We're migrating a huge portion of our workload to Lambda functions, so we're at about 1,400 Lambda functions right now. I expect that number to grow much, much faster, so we're trying to move a huge portion of our workload onto that. And the other interesting number up there would be the Dynamo Tables. We have about 4,000, 5,000 Dynamo Tables. I grabbed this a little while ago, so like I said, these numbers change pretty frequently. So at a 10,000-foot view, this is kind of a single deployment into one of those regions of Pure Cloud. Each one of the little boxes represents a microservice. These are EC2 auto-scaling based microservices, not necessarily Lambda-based ones. But each one of these is a microservice. Each one of the white lines would represent communication between microservices. And I just want to point out that I mentioned we have 370 microservices across each of our AWS environments, and we do something in the number of a few thousand deploys to dev and test of those microservices, as well as hundreds of those deploys to production. On average, I can't remember the exact number or the estimated number, but on average, our customers wake up to dozens of changes that happen throughout the night on the next day when they're coming in. Like, we're constantly changing these pieces. So because of that, because of the complexity, because of how complex this can be, automation is key. There's no way we could have an operations team monitoring all these servers and monitoring all the logs and dashboards and things like that. So everything we do is completely automated. A little bit about Sumo Logic numbers. So we've been a Sumo customer for, did we say it was 5?
Yeah, 5 plus
5
years.
years. So 5 years. We've been on AWS for almost as long, a little bit longer probably. But we adopted Sumo very, very early. Before we took our first customer on, we were using Sumo. That's because even before we even took customers on, scaling out elk stacks and things like that was too much to manage, so we ended up migrating to Sumo Logic. We have about 13 Sumo instances, that's Sumo Logic accounts. Unique logins per month, 464. That is users logging into it. We have a few hundred engineers and a little bit of support that log into Sumo Logic. So pretty much every single one of our engineers in a month logs into Sumo Logic at some point. And we'll go through different use cases on why they might do that and different personas, but pretty much every developer that we have logged into Sumo at least once a month. Many of them multiple times a day. We have lots of dashboards, and our total ingestion is in the order of 174 terabytes on average a month. Now, when we're talking about that data, like during this talk and that number, that's application logs, that's host logs, that's AWS infrastructure logs, things like ELB, VPC, flow logs, and elastic load balancer logs, those types of things. All that data is going to Sumo. UI searches ran 42,000, so we've done 42,000 unique UI searches. That means a user, one of those 400-something users, logged into the UI, typed in a query in Sumo Logic, and looked at their data. What's interesting about that number is if you split that, it's almost a 50-50 split between the number of searches that we're running in non-production as we are in production. So what that means is that our developers, the software development teams that make up those 370 microservices, are using Sumo Logic in dev and test just as much as they're using it in production to debug production outages. So it's very, very important that we have commonality in that tool set across all of these different environments. And configuration scheduled searches, that's like alerts and things like that. So automated alerting. So this is pretty obvious, right? But if we're talking about DevOps, service teams are responsible for every aspect of the application, right? They build it, they run it, they define the underlying AWS infrastructure and CloudFormation. They're responsible for supporting it. They're the ones that get alerted. They're the ones that configure the alerts. They're the ones that make sure it's secure, and they're the ones that do everything that is associated with owning a microservice. So how do we use Sumo Logic? So as Kalyan mentioned, I'm going to go through a couple different personas. Each of these personas we're going to go through. I'm going to talk about how we're using the data in each persona. And then hopefully I'll point out some ones that you guys haven't necessarily considered and they find useful, because there's some pretty normal ones that you would expect, and there's some ones that are kind of unique. Obviously earlier, like I'm mentioning multiple personas here: dev, test, ops, security, support, product. That's the same engineer, so there's not a split like I was saying earlier. They do all of these. Support, we do have a support care organization that would fall into that support block, but as well as the software development teams. All right, so first we're going to talk about dev. So across all those personas I just mentioned, debugging, triaging, and alerting is common across all of them. So I'm not going to repeat myself on all of these, but obviously in development, software engineers are logging in, they're debugging and triaging issues, they're setting up dashboards, and they're getting alerted when things are happening in dev. All of these are the same in all the environments, so we're deploying the same set of alerts into dev and test as we're doing into production, so the teams are aware of what type of things and how their alerting works. But the unique thing here is training. So when we onboard a new software engineer onto one of the microservice teams, one of the first things you'll do is probably take time, show them the code base, tell them what the applications do. But then not long after, they pretty much jump right into Sumo Logic. And the reason is because after you kind of show them the application code, it's a really great tool to show them what kind of things are important from the application side of things, like what do you need to look at. And eventually, at some point, that new engineer will eventually go on call, and they'll be on call for production systems. So it's a great chance to get them used and familiar to the tools before they even go on call with those things. So we're using the same tooling in dev and test, like I said, and it's just as frequently used in dev and test as it is in production. So it's a great training tool to get new users up to date on what things are important to my application or to our application. So for test, obviously debugging, triaging, dashboards, that's going to be common. It's going to be the same. But one unique case is tracking failures. So we have an SRE team. The SRE team constantly conducts fire drills with our microservice teams. And what they kind of do, the way that's kind of organized, is the SRE team will go to a microservice team and they'll say, we're going to induce some form of chaos. What happens if you can't talk to Dynamo? What happens if AWS loses an AZ? They'll tell them what they're going to do, and the teams will try to set their expectations on what they expect to happen. Right, so that's kind of how the exercise is laid out. You'll go to the team, you'll say, what happens if you can't talk to Dynamo? The team will say, we're gonna get an alert, or we'll get an unhealthy host count, or we'll see these errors, or whatever. And then they perform whatever form of chaos that they described that they were going to do, and they'll kind of see if that's actually what happened. Most of the time, it is not what they expected to happen. So you talk to the team, you say, what happens if an AZ goes away? they say, oh, we'll get these alerts and the hosts will go unhealthy and the load balancer will balance traffic to the other AZs and the AZ will scale out the other AZs. And that's not what happens, right? And this is where we're going to track to see what actually failed. And this is where we're able to create very meaningful alerts. And we can kind of do that based on historical outages, right? And things like that. We can do fire drills that simulate what we actually had happen in the past. Another thing that we do is performance and scale monitoring. So many people do all sorts of load testing, right? That's pretty common. But in most cases, usually that load test is targeting a specific web server or maybe your website or a couple of public APIs or fronting APIs. What we actually do, because we have insight into our production usage pattern, we take the production usage pattern, apply a multiplier to that, and throw that against our test environment. So we can actually get our platform being used in the exact same way it is in production at load in dev and test. And we monitor the results of that also in Sumo Logic. So not only are we monitoring the application level things to make sure there's not errors or problems or issues that they're having while the load test is running, we're monitoring the thing that's in creating the load. So here's a ramp up of our pure scale test, which is ramping up client connections to our servers. Operations, problem management, this is the one that everyone knows, right? This is what you would expect. I'm sending logs to Sumo Logic. I want to look in there. I want to triage production issues. But there's a few other things we do. Obviously, capacity planning is a big one. We use it to figure out, where do we need to focus our efforts. Dashboarding, obviously, we have production dashboards and operational dashboards. But two other things that are really interesting. So one is blast radius. Because I showed you that we have 370 microservices, when we're doing our postmortems, our RCAs, our 5Ys, or whatever mechanism you're doing after the fact, we always do our best to try to figure out the blast radius, right? Because when you have 370 microservices, there's a big difference between service A going down and that affecting B and C versus service A going down and affecting 360 other microservices, right? So blast radius is really important, and this is where we would go to try to figure that out. We'd figure out, is this transaction failing downstream? Like who's impacted, what microservices are impacted, how big is the blast radius? The other one is SLA tracking. So as we roll out new features, we usually roll those out either via feature toggles or to a small subset of customers. And let's say that were to cause an outage, this is where we would go to figure out which customers are actually impacted. Not only which customers could have been impacted, but which customers were actually impacted, which is different because the customers may have not been on the platform when there was the issue. So this is really a great tool for us to figure out which customers are impacted and get in front of it and kind of reach out to them with customer success and that type of stuff and meet up with them and proactively get in front of that issue. This is just an operational dashboard. Everyone's seen these. In this scenario, all the teams got alerted because real-time client connections were dropping. There's a big delta in real-time client connections. So yeah, this is where they would go. This is the first thing they directed to when they get alerted. They go right to this page. Security. Obviously, they're using it for monitoring, and they're obviously using it for, if we were to have a security issue, they would use it for triaging. On the monitoring side of things, they are doing all sorts of things around like monitoring security groups and CloudFormation updates, IAM roles, changes to the AWS account, as well as application changes, as well as host changes, so things on the host that look suspect, things like wgets or FTPs, things like that, as well as compliance tracking. I wanted to show this dashboard specifically because it doesn't show a lot of data, and it's kind of good. A lot of the other dashboards I was showing kind of show you all sorts of fancy graphs and things like that. You don't always need a lot of data to get your point across. So in this case, we have a compliance rule that we want all of our servers, our EC2 instances, to be replaced less than 25 days. And obviously, there's one service here that is out of compliance, so then automated process goes and sends them emails and gets them to roll out a new server. But we don't do any patching, so that's our solution is we roll out new EC2 instances with a new base AMI. I think the average life of our servers in production is like 6 days or something like that on average. So support. So this is a kind of unique use case. So obviously, support can use this for debug and triage. We can build dashboards off this data for them. But monitoring customer impact, this is a really big one. So before Sumo Logic had support for this feature, we actually had a web client that our support or customer care organization would log into. And it would front the Sumo Logic APIs to query data for them. So the individual microservice teams, the application development teams, can write a very, very complex query, as complex as they want. They can parameterize it and give it to support, and support can use that to query to see if a user is impacted. Like I said, previously that was done with a UI component that we built in-house, but now Sumo Logic actually has support for that. So what's great about this is the software development team wrote the really complex query. All the support engineer, customer care, whatever, has to come in here, plop in the identifier for that organization, run the query, and figure out what's going on. The nice part is when they open a support ticket, we're all on the same page, right? We know the query that they're using. We can use the same query, a more complex version of the same query to figure out more details, but we can give them access to this data in not a restricted way, but a controlled way to enable them to quickly service our customers much faster. And the last persona I was going to talk about is product. So on the product side of things, we can do it for obviously dashboards again. It's like beating a dead horse at this point, but usage patterns of the platform, this is a big one. Platform adoption and planning. So when a good example of this is we can check to see if certain APIs are being deprecated. We're an API-first company. Everything we build is in APIs. We operate as a platform. We have a lot of our customers consume us completely as a platform. So this is how we track to see if, should we be deprecating this API? Is somebody still using this old API? What should we do with this? Like it's used for that type of stuff. We can also use predictions to figure out if it's trending up or down and those types of things. A good example of this on the product side of things is we had an endpoint at one point that was doing something in the order of 2,000 requests per minute, something in the order of around 2,000 requests per minute. And we onboarded a new customer in a new region, and then all of a sudden that same endpoint went up to 30,000 requests per minute. And we said, oh, what's going on? And so we reached out to the customer. We figured out that they were actually using the platform in a very valid way. It was just not a way we had considered or anything we had thought about. And we kind of drove product decisions and added full support for what they were trying to do into the platform to make it easier. So we're actually making a whole lot of product decisions based off of this information, as well as getting in front of customer issues ahead of time before they actually have significant issues. So in this scenario, for whatever reason, there was an increase to API error rates, and this customer just happened to be much more impacted than all the others. So we can reach out to this customer ahead of time. We can talk to them. We can see what's going on. Maybe they're using the platform in a weird way. Maybe they're just a heavy user of the APIs, or they're using a specific API. But we can get ahead of it before it's a problem. So that's the last persona I had. I had two more other things since I kind of said they span out everything. Debug and triaging and alerting I kind of pulled out. So we'll talk about this because it's pretty much done in all the environments. And the one thing I wanted to give you guys is just kind of a small tip. So in this specific scenario, we had a service and it had no errors. It had no exceptions. There were no issues with CPU or memory or anything like that. But for whatever reason, they had some process that was stuck in a loop trying to process messages. No alerts went out. No service knew what was going on. The only alert that went out is we have a cost alerting tool that we wrote in-house that tells you when you're spending too much money. And it actually alerted because the log volume had gone from 200, I think that's gigabytes, so 290 gigabytes every couple hours to like 2.5 terabytes of data. So it's just a tip. You guys can use log volume as a good indicator for alerting. Another thing I wanted to mention, and anyone who's done AWS a lot has been rate limited at some point. I assume you've been rate limited at some point. And the interesting bit about that, so like I said, we're publishing CloudTrail logs to Sumo Logic, and then we're querying to find out when we're being rate limited inside of our AWS account. But one interesting thing about that, so all the microservice teams are responsible for their app, can do whatever they want. They can write in whatever language, they can use whatever tools they want. But pretty much all of them are going to have a common SDK for AWS. They're going to be using Bodo or the Node client or the Java client. So what that means is sometimes CloudTrail won't tell you you've been rate limited, but the SDKs will, so the responses. So we can write queries that span all of the applications to look at specific client exceptions coming out of the applications to determine that our AWS account is being throttled at the moment, even if CloudTrail's not telling you. Just another tip. It's been a very big help on several occasions. And the last thing I have is alerting. Obviously, all of these things that we talked about are tied to alerts, automated alerts. We're alerting the service teams. They're getting engaged. And one thing specifically is outlier functions. So we're using things like that to determine there's been a big delta or a big outlying thing. Good example of where we could have used something like that would have been that volume thing I mentioned earlier. When I was talking about the volumes going from a huge increase to the pretty standard, and then they're shooting up. So that concludes my portion of this. Callion's got a couple more slides, I guess. We'll let him talk, and then, if anybody has any questions, feel free to find me, and we can chat afterwards. Thanks.
Just one more slide. I mean, I think Brad and I talked about this. We know we're cutting into your lunchtime, so we wanted to make sure that this is short, tight, and let you guys, go off at that point. My next slide. All right. So if there's one thing that I wanted you guys to take away from this session, right, it's that single Sumo Logic platform that is used by Genesys powers all the use cases. I mean, that's the beauty of what Sumo Logic offers, right? We have a service in the cloud where you send all this data, and when you send those data, it's very easy to build out many of these use cases on the back of the Sumo Logic analytics offering. And Brad, would you say that it's pretty easy to sort of power up, newer use cases with Sumo Logic?
Oh yeah. We're constantly adding new use cases. They have pretty good support for most of the APIs and things like that. So we're consuming all those
Okay.
APIs and building interesting use cases.
Okay,
Like
and
I said,
I owe you $100 for that, though.
the parameterized searching thing is a good example, right? We were doing that ourselves, and then you guys came out with parameterized searching native in the platform, and we started using it. So
Yeah, and then Genesys is very prototypical of many of our other customers, right? I mean, you usually land out with one use case. It's either performance and availability or security. But then once you start getting the data into Sumo Logic, you're like, hey, I can do this, I can do that, and developers go crazy, and then they start to build all kinds of interesting things with our solution. So if I have to leave you with one last thought here, it's a very easy service to get started with. Services in the cloud. Go to sumologic.com. You can start to send us your data, and then you can start to get a lot of value from the solution. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we have a pretty massive booth this year. There are Sumos in there. We also have our SCs who are more than willing to show you guys a live demo of the product. Give it a try, talk to our SCs, and then we can go from there. We are open for Q&A here. Any questions about the solution, how Genesys uses the solution? Yes, sir.
I have a microphone here, sir.
there's got, yeah.
I'm coming over for you.
If you don't have a question you want to ask in front of everyone, feel free to hang around and ask us.
This is going to be hopefully an easy one. How do you handle alert fatigue with your staff? You said, I saw your slide said 1,300 plus alerts.
Yes.
That's a lot of alerts, especially
is.
when you replicate the prod stuff into dev and test.
Yes,
so how do
I
you
agree.
manage and handle alert fatigue?
That's a great question. So pretty much, like I said, the service teams are responsible for owning all of their configuration, including the alerts. So if there's alert fatigue on their alerts, it's on them. It's on that individual microservice team to tweak those as necessary. Usually for the dev and test thing, what people do in our case is set them at a lower priority. So they'll set a lower priority for alert that maybe goes to email and doesn't actually page them out, because we're using PagerDuty for that type of stuff. But we would just do a lower priority alert. But we always look into them. So if we're getting even low priority alerts, we prioritize those, because the same type of alerts are out in production. But the individual microservice teams are responsible for their own alerts in that case. So if they're getting the fatigue, it's on them to make sure that they're dialing those in. Most of the time in the guidance that we give, if you're coming up with a new microservice, create the alerts noisy, dial them back, right? It's always easier to do it that way as opposed to having them set the other way and not being alerted about anything and assuming everything's great. So, but yeah, no, that has come up on several occasions. But like I said, we're not configuring those for the team, so it's completely on them on what they decide is the appropriate stuff. What we actually have done on an automated process is, because sometimes software development teams may not be the best at creating those, right? Because they haven't done operations, they haven't done this stuff. So what we actually do now is our SRE team has automated processes that look at their alarms and see if recommendations, right? Or kind of look at it to see oh yeah, you're missing an alarm, or you should have this alarm here, and let the teams create it as needed. But they have processes to make sure that they do have all the alarms that they need. So yeah.
Do you have any process in place for the engineering teams to say, any kind of gates that say, if you're gonna deploy any new features, any new services, it must come with monitoring, alerting, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah.
It's not on the gating. It's more of, like I was saying, with the SRE kind of thing, it's more of a retroactive thing where they're confirming it. Initially, on an initial app, a brand new application coming on board, so like those microservices I was mentioning, those go through an architectural review, which is a manual thing for the very first time they go out, which they're not gonna let it go out with nothing configured. And like I said, then there's a continuous process to always evaluate to make sure that they do have the correct alarms that they need. But yeah, initially they would go through some form of an architectural review, right? Like I showed on there, we're very heavy users of Dynamo. We're very heavy users of Lambda. We're very heavy users of elastic, auto-scaling groups that are able to horizontally scale. If people come up sometimes, architectural reviews, and they're doing some crazy expensive solution or RDS or something like that, oftentimes we'll ask them about their choice. But yeah, that's kind of how they do it.
And Bradley, I think you were also telling me that you bake the monitoring agents and
yeah.
instrumentation in your AMIs itself, right?
Right. So we have a mutable infrastructure. Just a quick bit on how we kind of orchestrate all this. So we have a completely immutable infrastructure. The individual microservice teams define whatever host things they need, right? They just say, I need the JDK or I need whatever. It doesn't matter. But they provision on top of a base AMI. So Amazon publishes an AMI, Amazon Linux 2. We take the Amazon Linux 2. Weekly, we publish that AMI with the Yum updates. as well as baked into Sumo Logic log aggregation and APM agents and security monitoring tools and all that stuff's baked onto the host. The service team then layers their AMI on top of that, and then they deploy. So that stuff's all pre-baked into there, so they have all the fine-tuned controls. Like when their host comes up for the very first time, Sumo Logic's automatically sending their logs over to Sumo Logic. And then we give them the ability to configure different logging locations and things like that. But yeah, it's baked right into the host when that comes up.
Any more questions? Oh, there's one here. Yeah. Well,
What's your on-call process like since you're a NOC-free environment, and if you guys are 24/7?
it's all for you, Brad.
It depends on the service team. So some services have it broken down where, let's say they're responsible for 30 microservices. They'll have some part of the team that's responsible for 10 of those or whatever. My team, because my team is a software development team as well, we build tooling around the infrastructure and integrations with third-party vendors. My team does just rotations, 2-week rotations, 1 week on call standby and 1 week primary on call. And I forgot how many weeks we have in between. I think every 8 weeks or something like that. But yeah, we're on call for our services. But that's, again, up to the individual microservice teams. Now, obviously, if they're not getting alerted or not engaging or whatever, then probably other people in the company will have words with them at some point. But we do a really good job of immediately opening up video bridges and large-scale outages. Like our company does a really great job of doing that type of stuff. And we always do 5 whys, blameless postmortems, that type of stuff. We are very, very big. We do a weekly outage review. So every week, regardless of the RCA was customer impacting, any small outage or issue or anything along those lines, we bring up in the weekly outage review. And it's a really great experience. The teams do a really good job of kind of communicating with each other, like across team, to say, well, did you guys consider this? Or we saw a similar issue. Did you guys set up an alert for that? And all of those, out of all the RCAs that we do, we generate more tickets to look at alerting, look at these types of things, and address things like alert fatigue, right? And there's obviously, if you're doing on-call alerting for all of your engineers, there's going to be a point at which they're going to be alerted too much and miss an alert or something like that one time or another. But yeah, so that in and of itself could be a problem when you're doing your 5 whys, is that there was just alert fatigue and the alert got missed or something like that.
So I just had a question on how your organization handles the scenario of, so you've given everybody the tools to operate individually, but some of the graphs and things that you've shown are sort of like cross-cutting concerns, like of the whole product, of the whole organization. Is there a specific group that does that? Is that your post-mortem analysis team that has a need to write the queries to look at everything as a whole,
Just
not
to span
as,
everything?
as components, right?
Yeah, so are you talking specifically on, do you have a specific example? Are you talking about like transactions across microservices and that type of stuff, like insight into that? So for years, a long time before there were industry standards around things like trace IDs, span IDs, we had been doing that for a long time now. I wish I had the slide, an Illuminate slide, I had that talk, but I searched one correlation ID in Sumo Logic and I got the 15 microservices that single transaction had ran through. Most of the teams are pretty well versed in navigating that. We do our best. We don't restrict access to data in any way. So all the microservice teams, while they are allowed to pick whatever thing they want, right? They can use RDS or Dynamo if they have justification for those things. My team, and there's a few common tools we've converged on, specifically Sumo Logic. All your logs go to Sumo Logic. Our alerting, it's all the same alerting platform. Our on-call is all the same on-call platform. So we converge on a certain set of tools that the infrastructure team has decided that's what we're going to use for this use case, and everyone's familiar with those tools. Like I said, we're not restricting data in any way. So if you have access to production, like Sumo Logic logs, you can search all of production Sumo Logic logs. And teams have been doing it for a long time. Like I showed, every one of our developers is logging into the UI and running searches, so they're very, very familiar with the tool. So they're very good at not only being able to debug their own service, but their dependencies as well. Specifically on the utilization product side of things, we have a public-facing API. We call it public API, but it's our public layer that could be backed by tons and tons of different microservices, right? But the public layer is all going through the same layer, so it's pretty much querying on that. There's like a proxy layer that they can check to see API utilization, that type of stuff. But yeah, so that's pretty much it.
All right. No more questions? Oh, there is one.
For the scale of logs that you're shipping out to Sumo Logic, how much of that are you actually indexing, and how do you manage the sheer volume of logs that come in, and how much help do you get with
Yeah, that's a
that?
great question. That's a really good question. That's always so specifically application logs, it's up to the teams if they want to send like debug and that type of stuff. From a cost perspective, obviously we have to talk to them and work with them. In that example there, specifically the one I showed with the log line thing, that was our cost alerting platform saying, hey, somebody's spending 2 terabytes a day or something insane, which is a ton of logs. The other things, it just depends, right? So certain things like VPC flow logs, I don't know if you want to get into the nitty gritty, but VPC flow logs are very wordy, right? So those we kind of do ad hoc. Things like load balancer logs, private load balancer logs, we kind of do ad hoc. Public load balancers, we kind of ingest all the time because we like to get some live tail data on that type of stuff. So it just depends on the data. Sumo Logic, if you're more interested, it's actually a question for him, have some very interesting features they've recently come out with to allow different storage tiers and different ways to more intelligently send them data that we're going to be looking into, obviously, because we could use it to send less important data or data that we don't need like live data on to them at a reduced cost. So.
Yeah, I think just to speak to what Brad was saying, right? Look, we charge by the amount of data that you send to Sumo Logic. But what we have realized, and this comes up in all our customer implementations, is that not all analytics is the same, right? There are certain types of analytics where you need full feature analytics. I need alerts, I need dashboards, I need everything that Sumo Logic, the query engine can support. But then there are some other analytics like VPC flow logs. I want to get to it when I want to get to it. This is not the most mission critical logs. There are some other signals that I use to actually identify that I need to go into VPC flow logs and analyze that data. Why do I have to pay top price for this and top cost for this when I analyze it only on an ad hoc basis? So what we are now arrived at is a way by which you can segment your data, segment the value, the analytics value that you can get from the data, and pay for it appropriately. So this is a unique way of thinking about the economics of analytics. And we are the first vendor to actually bring this to the market. And so if anybody's interested, more than happy to have that discussion with you guys.
Feature called by a specific name?
Well, we got multiple tiers. We have something known as continuous analytics. We have something known as frequent and infrequent analytics. And then we also have something known as an archive analytics, where all you're doing is archiving your data into some S3 store and bring it in when it makes sense. And you pay different prices based on these analytic tiers.
Yeah.
Right?
On the inverse of that too, though, because that's on the side of like filtering the data so we're not sending too much, what we've begun to do, at least on the AWS side of things, obviously we send all of our CloudTrail logs to Sumo because they're one of the most useful bits of data that we have there. But we've even gone as far to send other bits of data from AWS that is good. So like things like ASG history, like we started to publish that over to Sumo Logic because once an ASG is gone, you lose all of its history. You can't query the endpoint for that. And on several occasions, that data we needed because the ASG history is actually very, very useful to have. So we've started to look into how can we get more data out of AWS and get it into a less ephemeral storage system of Sumo Logic and get it into somewhere where we can actually query it whenever we need to. But yeah.
Is that it? All right. So thanks for attending this session. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Brad. Brad is a little under the weather, and it's amazing how a little bit of Sumo Logic and a lot of ibuprofen can actually get someone to perform. So thank you.